right, time for a quick update here. It's been, I don't know, a month. So definitely like 2 weeks or more since I last filmed anything, just because there was so many random little issues that we were running into when trying to change the closing shims. So I'll be kind of just going over things I learned and what worked here, just to explain that, since I didn't catch much, if any of it, on film. And yeah, I'm going to record myself taking all the final measurements again to make sure everything's in spec. But as it is now, we should be good. But I definitely want to double check before starting to button everything up and put it all back together. So I'll try to explain this in the best way I can. So obviously when changing the closing shims, you first have to take the opening rocker arm off. So while twisting the crank, the engine crank, I'm just pushing on the opening rocker arm, whichever direction it goes, to get it off. And once it's off, that's actually a good position for the engine to stay in, I found. So I would keep this wherever I landed when the rocker arm came off. Then take the opening shim off, and then there's a variety of methods you can use to depress the closing rocker arm, which is holding that closing shim up. I found a tool like this to be effective, but kind of difficult because the end of it is just flat and it would slip off. So unless you got a really good grip on it, that would usually fail me. Flathead screwdriver with some tape on it also could work, but again, started to slip and just wasn't really the most effective thing. Something like this with a little bit of an indent or just like a hole in the end worked better to kind of catch the edge of the closing rocker arm. But again, just sometimes didn't really work exactly the way I needed it to, but I think this was the best one out of everything else. But what I used most was this little tool here, and this is from Desmo Times. It's specifically made for depressing the rocker arm, the closing rocker arm. And he also has another one that's more of like that, more like that handheld green tool where it's just got a hole in the end. But this, what you basically do is put it into, I'll do it over here. You put it into the rocker arm just like that, and then push down. And it takes the leverage of like kind of pushing up on this piece here and then pushing down, and then all that force kind of pushing the spring downward. It takes a little bit of finicking to get it to grip right on this little piece here, but once you get it, it does work pretty well. And I was able to do pretty much the whole thing myself, although my wife helped a lot. But I was able to hold this down with one hand, and with the other hand take the shim off, put the half rings on, and do all that myself. So once the opening rocker arm is off and you have basically everything ready to go, you take that depressor tool on the side and push this closing rocker arm down, and then the closing shim should just push down and expose the two half rings on the side. And so then what you're able to do is take a magnetic tool and kind of just like clip or suck those half rings out, and then the shim will just come off. Here's an example here of what those rings look like. They're really small, and I did find that I was suggested to reuse the existing ones if they're not in bad shape or they haven't cracked or anything, because they do tend to compress a little bit. And so over time, if you reuse the same ones, you're likely to get a better fitment and adjustment with your shim size changing only, and not putting in new half rings as well. Because if you do both, then over time it might actually become more of a gap as those half rings compress. So I actually have new half rings in the intake side of my horizontal head. So I'm thinking of replacing them. These are the old ones. But if I don't have the right shim size to account for that, then I might just keep them in and just note that later on that I will need to probably just keep an eye on that one more than the others, because those half rings may compress and increase the gap a little bit. So after you take those half rings out, what you're able to do is basically put the correct shim size on, whichever one you're either testing, or if you know which one you need, you just kind of slide it on. And then while kind of doing the same thing, while depressing the closing rocker arm and pushing the closing shim down a bit with your finger, you just have to like really just gently get those little half rings in there, and there's a little indent on the valve stem where they sit. I was doing one at a time, so I put one at a time and then just let the shim kind of confirm that it's in place by pushing the shim back up. And you can let the closing rocker arm pressure rest on it, even when it's only got one half ring in there. I didn't see any problem with that. And then once you're ready with the other half ring, go in and do it again. And it's just like one on top, one on the bottom, or one on each side. There's going to be a gap in between both sides, or maybe one end will be touching and there'll be a gap on the other side. That's fine. I didn't really see, or there's no issues identified in that. The gap doesn't have to be like perfectly even on both sides. They're just kind of holding that shim in place. And I know ideally they say to keep, if you're reusing the old shims, to keep the old shims in the same orientation. But realistically, I found that to be pretty difficult. Half the time the half rings were just falling out of my hand and into this oil pan. I was just trying to get them on. So I wouldn't sweat that too much. I'm not gonna. And then once it's in, you can kind of pull that closing shim up to confirm they're in place. You can twist it a little bit, and it should like move up. The shim should move up and down freely. It shouldn't be like locked. Like I did get one of them pinned and locked in there at one point, and I had to use a knife to pry it out. That was difficult. That honestly took most of the time away because I just could not get it out. So be very careful with that. Make sure they're in the right place before you put all that pressure back on with the closing rocker arm, because it could get stuck. But anyways, once that's on, you want to get the top opening rocker arm back on. To do that, I found you could back up. So counterclockwise is like the correct rotation for the engine, and it moves easier that way, you'll find. So after you're done putting that closing shim on and you're ready to put everything back together to measure, what you want to do is back it up a little bit. You'll see like it might just have to go like a quarter of a turn or so backwards, and then this closing rocker arm will be able to freely perfectly move back and forth. If it's ever so slightly too far this way or too far this way, there'll be a little bit of a knocking point because the rocker arm's not like in that perfect opening. So you want to just get this adjusted to where the rocker arm slides back and forth perfectly while pushing backwards, like while pushing it up in its topmost position. And once it's there, then you want to put your opening shim back on top, like you can see there, right there. Put that back on, and then it's kind of finicky, but basically I was just using this tool here to just put a little bit of pressure on that opening shim to just push it down a little bit. It doesn't move much, but it moves a little tiny bit. You push that down, and then you slide the opening rocker arm over. And once you do that, you can kind of rotate the engine counterclockwise and ensure that everything stays in place and it goes through the rotation like that. And yeah, you can wiggle it back and forth, make sure it's good. And that's pretty much it. And then when you start to measure, I was doing the loaded unloaded method because it found it so hard to put the feeler gauges in between the closing shim and the closing rocker arm. So I would measure unloaded. I would just basically measure the opening. So we'll get it to top dead center first. So the way I do that, like I mentioned before, is with the like if you're measuring the exhaust side, while the intake side is about halfway or fully downward, in its stroke. So if I'm trying to measure the exhaust side, and I'm looking here, it's starting to move there. So when it's like right about halfway in, so right about there, that's when you want to measure the opposite side, and that goes for every cylinder head. And so I measure the gap in between the top opening rocker arm and opening shim, and then I put pressure on the closing rocker arm with my tool, and then remeasure the same place. Remeasure in the same place, and the purpose of that is obviously to get like a combined gap. And so what I found with the exhaust side, with the one that I was measuring here, is that I could fit a 1.13 millimeter feeler gauge, and then the 0.15, I would really have to like shove it in there to get it inside when it's not being depressed. But then when I put pressure on the closing rocker arm, it will go in much easier. And so it's basically just a little bit of a gap there. It should be less than 0.05. So if you can put, let's say, if you can't put a 0.1, and then when you push it down and depress the closing rocker arm, you can put a 0.15, then the gap is 0.05, and that's technically too much according to the spec. So yeah, you're kind of just like guesstimating the numbers, but basically if you can push the closing rocker arm down and you could spin, not freely, but just like barely spin the closing shim with your fingers, which I can, it just takes effort, then there's a gap. And so that's basically what you want. If you can't move it at all and there's no difference when you push it down in terms of the measurement, then it's probably too tight. It's probably just locked in there. And I found that to be the case with the 2.9 on this side here, but the 2.85 had just enough of a gap so to be perfect. And that's pretty much the method I used. And again, I was only working on the two closing shims on the horizontal head. Same thing goes for here. It's just how the heck you're gonna get your hands in there, I don't know. But I had to obviously learn on this side, which is a blessing to be able to do it on a much more open side of the engine. If I have to change these, I'm debating just taking the engine out, at this point, or just sending it to a shop, and have them do those, because it's tricky. I mean, it's such a small space. So let's go over the measurements now. Okay, so for the horizontal exhaust cylinder head, the opening shim measured at a 0.10 millimeter, went in fine, felt good. 0.13 had a little more resistance, so it's kind of like maybe a bit too much pull. The 0.15 really doesn't go in unless you super force it. It does not just easily slide in. Closing shim, when I had it depressed, the 0.15 goes in and it moves back and forth when you have it depressed. When you let go of the closing rocker arm, it won't move back and forth. So there's just a little bit of a gap there. So that's within spec, that's good. That's a winner. I have it all written down, but just for reference, the opening shim is now a 2.55 millimeter. It was a 2.7. And the closing shim is a 2.85 millimeter. Closing shim from Ducati, opening shim from Desmo Times. And the old closing shim in there was a, I believe a 2.7 as well. Yes, it was. It was a 2.7. The 2.9 was too tight, so we went down one to the 2.85. And then last thing, we used the original, or the existing half rings in there that were in there when I got it. I'm actually making a change on the horizontal intake side, it had a 2.95 opening shim on there, and the 0.10 went in fine, the 0.13 kind of went in fine, and then the 0.15 started to get stuck. I put on the 3. I had a 3 extra, like an extra shim that was a 3.0 millimeter. And the 1 goes in fine now, and then the 0.13 doesn't go through. One thing I'll note that I forgot to mention earlier, using forceps like this, which I actually bought these guys here, and they have a locking mechanism on the end. While a good idea on paper if you kind of wrap it with like a towel or tape or something, because these are grooved edges. As you can see, they're serrated or whatever you want to call it. It didn't really work. I tried it on the exhaust side to hold the valve from moving, and it kind of just started to like create a bit of a wear on the valve, and I was getting scared. So I would recommend not doing that. What I did instead to hold the valve up from falling down was using the magnet holder, and or my fingers. And I noticed it wasn't really an issue on the exhaust side because gravity helped keep the valve down. On the intake side, it was definitely more of a concern, and so you can kind of have a magnet holder like right here, just holding the top of the valve up. And you do have to move it when you're putting the shim on and stuff like that. I know I just kind of got lucky, I guess, and it didn't move when I was putting the shim on. It just kind of stayed there. But if you're really concerned, I guess you could gently hold it with those forceps. Just don't hold it tight. I noticed it started to actually wear on the valve stem a little, and you don't want that. So yeah, that's what I did for that. Also, that hole that I mentioned earlier, I think it's, where is it? There's a hole in here somewhere. There's basically a hole on one of the sides. I can't really see it here, but very tricky. It's like an oil drainage hole. It's a very tricky place for half rings to get stuck. You want to plug that up by any means necessary. I was going to use, I used one of these. I just kind of put one of these Allen keys in there and tied one end with a zip tie or a piece of string to be able to pull it back up, to block the half rings from getting inside that hole. I think there's a better picture of it. Yeah, he's kind of plugging it there. But yeah, I mentioned it earlier, just make sure to do that. It's a necessary step. Okay, so for the horizontal intake side, I'm still kind of torn on the opening shim. The 2.95 just feels like it's too loose. The 1.10 goes in easy, the 0.13 goes in easy, the 0.15 like starts to feel some resistance, and then the 0.18 doesn't go through. And I want to try to get closer to 0.1 and be on the low end of that spec. So the 3 feels pretty good. Like the 0.09 goes through no problem. The 0.1, there starts to be like ever so slightly too much resistance. I mean, it's probably fine, but I just feel like I don't like, it's just too much resistance. So it's unorthodox, but I'm gonna shave down the shim just a tiny bit. I know it's not recommended, but I just want to get a perfect clearance there. I'm gonna keep the 3.0 millimeter shim, opening shim. I'm just gonna shave it down ever so slightly. And then the closing shim is perfect too. So like if I have the 3 0.0 millimeter opening shim. The 0.13 feeler gauge like basically won't go through, and then the 0.15 definitely won't. When I'm pushing the rocker arm down, the 0.13 goes through. The 0.15 does as well, but you really need to force it in. 0.18 not even close. So, and then I can move the closing shim with my fingers, and those have the new whatchamacallits, new half rings in there. So I'm going to keep those in, because if I put the old ones, it's likely going to grow the spec to be bigger. And if I don't have a shim that's bigger, it could be out of spec. So I'm going to keep those in, and then just have to keep an eye on it in the future, pretty much. But yeah. And just for reference in there, I have a Desmo times 2.80 for the closing shim, and the opening is the 3.0 3.0 Ducati from, I believe, one of the other cylinder heads. I think I reused that 3.01. So yeah. So like I said before about this closing shim, I really don't want to mess with it. Turns out I do have, because it's a 2.8, because it's a 2.8, I actually do have a 2.85 closing shim right here. I kept this one. So that 2.85 closing shim could, in theory, work better, because it'd be adding a 0.05 gap. It would be like closing it by 0.05, and then if I put the original half rings in, that could subtract a little bit because they're depressed already. So that could work out in theory. I'm not going to mess with it for now. I'm just going to keep an eye on it. If it does end up out of spec, I could go one of two ways, by just putting in the bigger shim with those half rings after they've been compressed after however many miles, and that could work. Or if I put that larger closing shim in, and then there's not enough of a gap, I can put in those old half rings and maybe give myself enough of a gap. So I got options, but for now it's fine. I'll just keep it like that. I'm scaring myself. I thought I had measured the closing shims on the vertical cylinder right, but it looks like there's actually a pretty big gap, unfortunately. So on the exhaust side, vertical head exhaust side, the opening shim in there is, let me see, it's a 2.4 in there. It originally was a 2.6, so it's a 2.4, and that fits great. The 0.10 millimeter slides in no problem. The 0.13 doesn't really go through. So so that one's good. And then when I depress it, all the way up to the 0.18 goes through. So if the 0.13 doesn't go through, then it's less than that. And if the 0.18 does go through, that means that it's greater than a 0.05 gap. So in there right now is it's a 2.90. So I would probably need a 2.95 or a 3.0 in there. Unfortunately. Gonna have to just go get one of those shims and pop it in and see. Maybe I can trade for one of the other ones, but if not, then we'll just have to purchase that like 2.95 or 3.0 and remeasure. It definitely feels too big, it feels like it's out of spec, so it is what it is. But we'll move on to the intake side of the vertical head and take those measurements. Okay, quick update here. On the horizontal exhaust side, I have a 2.85 closing shim in there, and the 2.55 Desmo Times opening shim. Fit good, like it was on the looser side, I guess. Like the 0.10 went in, the 0.13 also went in, but like with too much resistance, and then the 0.15 did not. But when I used the old 2.6 original opening shim from one of the vertical heads, the 0.09 went through, the 0.1 went through, and then the 0.13 didn't. I kind of like that fitment better, so I think I'm going to stick with that. Just noting this because I'm not sure what I ended up saying later on in the videos. Okay, on the vertical intake side, the opening shim in there is, I believe, it's a 2.95, and that's from Desmo Times. It's great. The 0.10 millimeter slides in nice. The 0.13 right here does not fit in, so that one's perfect, and we'll measure the closing now. Okay, so for the vertical intake head, the closing shim should be good. The 0.13, which did not go in when not depressed, does go in, and the 0.15 also does, but with like a lot of resistance, the 0.18 does not. So at most, you know, it's a 0.05 gap, but I would say it's probably less than that. Although it could be that much of a gap. But yeah, at most it's that. I'm not gonna go ahead and go through the trouble of changing that one out unless I have the size handy, which it would be a 2.7, which I actually do have. So if I wanted to, I could test that. So I might to see if I can get just ever so slightly smaller of a gap there. Because it may just be at the top end of 0.05 or possibly more, but probably not. But the best thing to do is to like put the tightest closing shim on there to get barely a gap, I think, you know, because it should be less than 0.05, you know, so that's, I think, the best method of going about it rather than having it too big to be like just big enough. So yeah, we'll see. Maybe I'll swap that out. Looks like both of these need to be worked on. All the opening shims are good, and the closing shims down there are good. So it's this vertical head now. It's giving us a problem. So that'll wrap it up for this video, I think. We'll continue messing with all these shims later on in another one, but this video is long enough as it is. So yeah, that's just kind of the saga of what can happen with a Desmo service. It obviously can be really tricky and frustrating, but very rewarding at the same time, and it's been a learning experience that I've learned so much more about this bike through. So we'll pick it up with the vertical head closing shims, and then starting to button everything up and put everything back together. So catch you in the next one.